And what's so interesting about this is international authorities like the UN, like the WHO, like our own CDC, they were unable utterly to project any kind of global authority on COVID. All the countries just went their own way. And all of a sudden, everybody was saying, well, we're going to do what we're going to do. And even the Schengen area agreement in Europe, where 26 European countries are allowed to travel amongst each other without passport, that broke down. In Canada, we saw provincial travel prohibited. You couldn't even drive from Newfoundland over to Montreal or something like that unless you had some express purpose. And there were even some suggestions for, and briefly, having checkpoints between U.S. states. So, again, who's to say, who's to judge how different localities around the world, around the country, act under duress? And I would suggest that this calculation becomes more and more difficult at scale, moving from the local to the regional to the national to the international level. Crises remind us that local matters. And this is exactly what we should want and expect in a pandemic, right? This is what we want, competing visions as to the severity and the scope of the problem, differing localized approaches, experimental treatments, nimble entrepreneurs providing resources and supplies to us. And we're going to have scoreboard, and to an extent we do have scoreboard. Now, we have some data 16 months later. We know that ventilators didn't work. We know, for the most part, that lockdowns didn't work. We're starting to think that maybe masks don't work either. And so hopefully there's going to be remorse. There's going to be recriminations. There's going to be, hopefully, calls for some criminal action against some of these governors who failed us so badly. So what we have to avoid is allowing the political class to gain from all this. Because if there's a silver lining for all this, it's that we have to understand how, at the end of the day, South Dakota really isn't New York City after all. They're two different places. And why do we have to have the same rules for 330 million people with respect to COVID? Well, I think a lot of Americans woke up to that over the last 16 months. But then what follows is, if we could have different rules relating to COVID across 330 million people, why can't we have different rules about taxes and guns and abortion and climate change and everything else? So that's the opportunity. That's the silver lining behind COVID. Now, one thing I have to show you, I can't resist. I'm starting to really dislike this guy. He's starting to piss me off. I don't want his new normal. But this is a beautiful thing. This isn't some think tank survey. This is from United Van Lines. So they spent 2020 figuring out who's moving where. So guess what? California, New York, and New Jersey, and Illinois lost people, and Florida and Texas and Tennessee and some other states gained people. Shocker there. So what's happening, ladies and gentlemen, is a form of soft secession. This is people moving with their feet. And I'm not even going to say that this is necessarily ideological. People are fleeing dysfunction. And so far, there's not a lot of sign that, blue state voters are turning Texas or Florida blue. So far, there's not a lot of data or evidence that that's happening at all. Maybe it's the red state voters leaving California and Illinois and New York and New Jersey. We don't know. But what we've had is this remarkable experiment in federalism that's having real results. I mean, there's a real separation taking place in this country, and I think it's an absolutely beautiful thing. And we actually have a real-world example of where federalism works beautifully. And that's Switzerland. All you have to do is look at the Swiss government's website, and they lay out the principle of subsidiarity and federalism. Now, the big difference in Switzerland is that most people pay about 80% of their overall tax burden either to their local canton or their commune, which is their local commune or their local canton, and only about 20% to the feds. Whereas here in the United States, that's flipped. We send about 80% of it to Uncle Sam. So that's a problem. But apart from that, there's no reason why we couldn't be engaging in a great awakening, I think, for a federalist system in the United States. And not because of constitutionalism or anything like that, just because of people's desires to live in places that work and to live around people who share their thoughts and attitudes and opinions and values.